Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Stacy. He is currently at MUSC in South Carolina, but he is another very impressive individual who has been a dean and a vice chancellor. He was the vice dean of clinical research here at Duke. That's when we got to work together. And he's written the Handbook of Dystonia. And I thank you. He's going to give a talk on FDA-approved neurotoxins.
Dr. Woodward, thank you for letting me come back to home. I really appreciate the courtesy of your invite. And Chris, I got to tell you, I really miss Richard Anderson. And anybody who's ever heard him talk know that Chris channels Richard Anderson, and we're glad to have you a part of the community. That was a lot of fun. Less blood than Dr. Anderson's surgeries also. So Dr. Buckley talked a little bit about how we got to botulinum toxin. This was originally described in an illness by Justinius Kerner in 1820. And there were a large group of people who went to a gathering, and they ate a lot of contaminated meat. And he called it fatty poisoning, but it was figured out that this was sausage. And the Latin word for sausage is botulinus. And so botulinum toxin came about when by another microbiologist who isolated the Clostridium botulinum organism. And then in the 40s and maybe the 30s, Edward Shantz was working with the US government looking at botulinum toxins. I don't think he could talk about that very much, but Alan Scott was in his lab. Alan Scott went to be an ophthalmologist, became very interested in eyelid movement abnormalities, called Edward Shantz and asked for one of his strains of toxins, and it turned out to be the perfect one for the time, and that was oculinum, and it turned into Botox. But he began working with that in animals in 1973. In 1980s with humans, you've heard a little bit of that story, and it was approved for the treatment of blepharospasm in 1989. Myoblock is a type B toxin that was approved for blepharospasm in 2000. It was interesting, there are the two types of toxin. A toxin causes a little more weakness and a little less GI symptoms and dry mouth symptoms and decreased sweating, while botulinum toxin type B causes more dry mouth and more GI symptoms. So in my practice, when I see people with Parkinson's disease, I use a lot of Myoblock for drooling, because it helps that immensely. And we don't use it as much, I don't think, in treating muscle disorders. Dysport was approved in the US in 2009, but if you have a European-trained doctor, that European-trained doctor was probably much more familiar with Dysport and maybe something that's used more often in that position. Xeomin in 2010, and this year a toxin called Daxxify was approved that has some advantages that may be longer acting because of a particular molecule that is attached to help it target the neuromuscular junction better. There is another toxin that's been approved for cosmetic use only, and just since I'm supposed to talk about all FDA approved, I thought I'd mention that one. There's type A toxin, that's Botox, and type B Myoblock, and I've borrowed those from the websites, but you can see there's a binding domain, so this toxin binds to the cell with that binding domain, and there's a translocation domain that puts the active molecule into the cell, and then there's a catalytic domain that does its thing. And all of the toxins have a similar profile. So what happens with type B toxin, it binds to the molecules vamp synaptobrevin, and that is so when you have a release of neurotransmitter, you have a vesicle that binds to a cell membrane and releases the neurotransmitter. The type B toxin binds to the molecules on the vessel, and all the type A toxins bind to the end plate of the membrane. But both of them prevent the fusion of those membranes. And so you have a binding, and then you have internalization, which is that translocation, and then you have release. This is that complex as it swirls together and brings the vesicle to the cell membrane or the plasma membrane to release that toxin to affect the muscle. And you can see that type B is on that little blue squiggly line, and then type A is on the green. When those don't fuse together, you don't have a release of neurotransmitter, then you have a weakening of the muscle. And here are the types of toxins. In terms of looking at the similarities and differences, I tried to look at dosing range per eye. Now, the Xeomin dosing range is listed 30 to 33 units as a part of the label. I use Xeomin and Botox pretty interchangeably, and so I changed that. So my friends at Xeomin, please forgive me for going off label, but I think that it allows us to think of more of how you can use the toxin efficiently. Daxxify probably is going to be the 25 to 50 units range. It looks to be the same dose for glabellar lines or facial wrinkles as other cosmetic toxins, but it has not been approved specifically for blepharospasm at this time. Dysport has a different dosing range, and 100 to 120 units is probably the equivalent to the 25 to 50 for the others. MyoBlock has a much different range, and that is estimated to be 1,000 to 2,500 units. But it is simply the way mouse units were calculated, or units were calculated years ago when we would see what killed 50% of the mice that were injected, and that was the lethal dose, and it doesn't translate to humans. If you look at the vial sizes, there is a Botox cosmetic 50 unit vial, but you can't use that in dystonia. But those are the dystonia vials that are available, plus the cosmetic toxin at the bottom. You can see that if you use 25 units of Botox or Xeomin, which is why I changed the dosing range, my friends at Xeomin, so you could say, because that 50 unit vial is very helpful if you only need 25 units per eye. And so it saves you some money. And if you look at Daxxify all the way at the end, that's a 12 to 24 week benefit. So if you have a 12 to 24 week benefit in a toxin, that is potentially something all of you are going to be interested in. Now, their price per vial is much higher than prices per vial for the other toxins, but they, I think, are pricing to say you're going to use that 2 or 3 times a year rather than 4 times a year. So as I think about who I'm going to use this Daxxify for, as we learn how to use it, it's going to be for people who get 8 weeks benefit or 6 weeks benefit and don't get a full 3 months benefit, to see if we can get you to more than 3 months benefit. And we can say, yeah, that's going to be easy, but we have very little experience with it, particularly neurologists, because we've just been using it in cervical dystonia. So ophthalmologists are going to get these questions at the break to say, how does it translate from glabellar lines to eyelids? And they will be the people that can give a more accurate assessment of the potential for this in blepharospasm. But it is a potential breakthrough in terms of how you're going to be able to treat your illness. It's going to be interesting for me to see what people do. I really like taking care of people with blepharospasm. I agree with Dr. Bleckley. You are the nicest people. I enjoy talking to you about your vacations and talking to you about your events. And if I only get to see you twice a year, that's less fun for me. But it's also less money for me. And so you need to evaluate how you're going to change if you can be injected twice a year, and whether you don't have my physician costs 4 times a year. And we're not going to talk to you about that in the exam room very much, but it's something that's going to really change fundamentally how physicians are going to be treating dystonia, and potentially how they're going to be treating glabellar lines. But again, my friends to my left are going to give you that answer. That's the major thing I really have to tell you about the differences in toxins, other than people are trained with different toxins. So I went to work for Dr. Jankovic in 1990 because he was one of the 4 places that I could get training in botulinum toxin. I didn't want to go to New York City. I didn't want to go to Chicago. I didn't want to go to California. So I trained with him. Botox was the only thing available from 1989 to 2000. I really have a great experience with Botox. Now, if you trained later than that, you're going to have more experience with Xeomin, and you're going to have more experience with MyoBlock. And if you trained in Europe, you're going to have way more experience in Dysport. You want me to inject you with something that I have the most experience in. Period. It's my job to get experience with all the toxins, because if I use one and it doesn't work as well, I'm going to think about using another toxin. But I am careful about how I gain that experience, and I don't gain that experience on people who are doing well. I gain that in people who have not done as well. So I think it's a fair question for you to ask your doctors, do you have experience with other toxins if you're not doing very well? Because it comes down to where you inject and the toxin you use and how experienced you are. And so those are the questions that I would tell you that I think are most important for you. And so in terms of my injection goals and strategies, you got to find an optimal dosing for every patient with all those toxins. And I like to see a response within 3 to 5 days. I like to see a duration of benefit for 10 to 12 weeks with everything but Daxxify. I don't know about Daxxify, but the literature suggests it's going to be 18 to 24 weeks. And I don't want to have any side effects. If I mentioned Daxxify, so 3 to 5 days and 16 to 24 weeks and don't have any side effects. And so here are my injection spots. They didn't all come out, but that's enough of my injection spots. It makes my point. But if I see a delayed onset or a short duration, I'm going to increase the dosing where possible. I'm going to change my injection sites if I need to. And finally, if I still can't get a good response, I'm going to change toxins, see if I get better with another toxin. If I see side effects, I'm going to reduce the dosage where possible. I'm going to change the injection sites, and I'm probably going to change toxin there also. This is not real difficult math for me. This is a very straightforward process, and your job is to say I kicked in 8 days or kicked in 2 days, and it wore off in 4 weeks or it wore off in 12 weeks, and I had ptosis for 2 months. Those are the things I need to know to change the way I'm going to inject. And so, in summary, dose response differs with each toxin. Physician experience also varies with each toxin. Side effect profiles are pretty similar for the A toxins. The toxins are really priced at an annual basis, and short duration responses can be changed by changing dose, changing location, and changing toxin. Thank you for letting me be here at the 42nd meeting.
And that's a great overview of so many toxins. Dr. Stacy has so much experience with toxins. Me being on the aesthetic side, I have experience, I get to wear both hats, so I work a lot with all of them. The Daxxify is really interesting. You can't really compare it because when you're comparing those glabellar doses, what they use in the clinical trial is 40 units of the Daxxify to 20 units of the Botox, but yet they come in the same size vial. So if you're using Botox, you use 1/5 of the vial to get that 20, for example. And the Daxxify, you actually have twice as much, although it has the same protein load supposedly in that dose. Interestingly, for the cosmetic trials, they did not meet that 6-month mark. The FDA would not let them claim the 6-month longevity that they were trying for. I've tried it myself before. It was okay. Yeah.
We had this period where we had allergic or autoimmune responses back in the older days that we haven't seen for a while. So now we have a new conjugated formulation that also, what do you think about the
Are you talking about the
Daxxify?
Yeah, so the way all these toxins work is they put, most of them, put albumin in the vial to keep it from sticking to the glass and sticking to the rubber stopper. The Daxxify, they put this little teeny protein in that surrounds it, so not only does it not stick to the glass, but the theory was it doesn't stick to itself. And this man named Connor, who is the head toxin scientist at Allergan, switched over to this company that makes Daxxify on the promise that maybe if these molecules didn't stick to each other, it would last longer. And it might, but you have to use twice as much, which costs you twice as much to provide it. And so they're telling us, on the cosmetic side, instead of selling for $12 a unit, sell it for $9 a unit. So it's kind of confusing. You end up giving a larger protein load. And of course, we're worried about antibodies. And the big thing with MERS, Xeomin, our sponsor, is the protein load is a lot less. So a Botox molecule weighs 900 kilodaltons, and a Xeomin has just a little core that does the work. That's the core 150. And so it's a naked molecule, so it has less protein. The theory is maybe you'll get less antibodies and your toxins may have less neutralizing antibodies. But those studies are really long-term. It's really, really hard to prove if what's really causing it, if you're flipping around toxins and things like that. It's also important to note that the Dysport is not FDA approved for blepharospasm. It is for the cervical dystonia. Some sympathetic insurance companies may cover it for you, but a lot of times you may end up having to pay cash. Same with the Daxxify. What is it approved for dystonia? For adults?
It's approved for cervical.
For cervical, just like Dysport, yeah.